Hello, my name is Ross Quigley. I was born in Cobourg in 1944, and I, with my family, moved to this site in 1947. For those of you that don't recognize this site, it is the parking lot right across the street from the post office. Directly behind me was a large two-story house which we moved into in 47. There was both an upstairs and downstairs apartment with a common entrance off of McGill Street. The address was 205 McGill. Over the years, we lived in both of those apartments. Two other families lived in those apartments during our tenure there. Tom Yost and his wife and their daughter Brenda were one of the families, with the other family being Bill and Doris Walmsley. They had 3 children at that time, a daughter, Bev, affectionately nicknamed Puffer, and 2 boys, Harry and Howard, twin boys. Later on, they had another set of twin boys, Jim and Joe. My friend Paul Leonard gave me a bit of history of the house. The house in the earlier years was known as the Waite House, not because of its color, but because 2 sisters with the surname Waite lived there for many years. The house subsequently was purchased by a man named Tom Hardcastle. He also lived there for many years. Mr. Hardcastle was a long-time teacher at George Street Public School, also known as the Thomas Gilbard School. In front of me in this photo, and to my left, right on the corner of Queen and McGill, and on the same property, was a mini putt golf course with a small picket fence around it, painted orange and black, and apparently quite popular with local families. Again, this information provided to me by Paul Leonard. To my right and fronting on Queen Street were 2 small white wooden cottages. I should mention at this time that the house we lived in, and those 2 small cottages were owned by Stan and Rosina Williams, whom also owned the Shadow Hotel across the street. 2 of their employees lived in those cottages for a period of time. The easterly cottage was occupied by Frank Urquhart and his family. Frank was the chef extraordinaire at the chateau. The westerly cottage was occupied by Lawrence Brooks, another chateau employee. Brooksy, as he was referred to, was the gopher swamper at the chateau, cleaning, washing floors, filling beer fridges, all the odd jobs required in running a successful business. Brooksy performed the same functions for the Williams family at the Pavilion, or the Pav, which they also leased or rented for a number of years at the bottom of McGill Street. Unfortunately, I do not have a picture of that old house, but I do have this Quigley family reunion photo taken in the early 1950s. You can see the corner of the house and the back of the chateau over the heads of the people on the left, and the Lakeview house as a backdrop to the people on the right-hand side of the picture. We will talk about the Lakeview house a little later. This next picture is actually the back of the new Zapp record store on the southwest corner of McGill and King Streets. For many, many years it was the site of Hooley Gardens, a Chinese restaurant that served the best food between Toronto and Montreal, according to my uncle, who probably ate in every Chinese restaurant between Toronto and Montreal. When I lived on McGill Street, though, this was Dr. Bill Wade's office on the main floor with his residence above. Dr. Wade was a Rotary president in 1939-40. In those days, there was about an 8-foot-high brick wall that ran from the back door down McGill Street to his garage just north of the back lane that took you behind the buildings fronting on King Street. Mr. and Mrs. Wade's back lawn and gardens were behind that wall. Dr. Wade's garage was of great curiosity to us in those days, and that was because it housed his brand new salmon-colored 1956 T-Bird. In the back laneway, right behind Dr. Wade's garage, was a small old wooden barn that I believe my brother and I got a good boot in the rear end for playing with matches in. A little further to the west in the lane, you can see 2 large additions have been put on to the original buildings. The first addition, which later became McGregor's Bar and Grill, had a very large brick barn with a hip roof in place of that addition. The addition on what is now Jim Gordon's Insurance simply had a lovely high veranda, and in those days it was owned by Laura Crow and her sister. As I recall, there were two very petite ladies with strawberry blonde hair, and the business of the day was a slumber inn. It would be similar to today's bed and breakfast, but stays would be more likely for a week or two with meals included. This next picture is of the back of the Oasis restaurant, which was the Houlihan house, and where brothers John, Charlie, Hap, and Bill lived. The patio area of today was their backyard, complete with clothesline and a great lawn for playing catch or throwing a football around. This next picture moves to the front of those buildings we've just talked about, and looking north to McCober's funeral home, which was Beau's funeral home in those yesteryear days. On the left side of the main building, in the west parking lot, was the local registry office. It was a small gray brick building with bars on the windows, and for whatever reason, I just loved that little building. Joan Chalovich and I had a short discussion about the building a couple of weeks ago. Maybe I will get lucky someday and find a picture of it. The next picture is from what is now McCober's east parking lot. This building was used as a military hospital in 1866, when a detachment of British regulars was in town during the Fenian Scare. This building was later purchased by a good friend of mine by the name of Ernie Outwin, whom is Cobourg renowned for his wonderful animated Christmas display, and which was shown in this second picture through the window on the left. The display started in 1953 and has run continuously every year since at Christmas time. Ernie had 6 apartments in the building, and 2 familiar Cobourg names resided there over the years. Jim Tracy and his wife Madeline. Jim was a Cobourg councillor for many years. The other couple were Ben Hercock and his wife, who had previously owned the farm just south of McKean's Motors. Ben was a very good golfer at the old Cobourg Club and won the club championship there on more than one occasion. Ernie and his wife Gretchen also ran Outwin's taxi from that location. His wife ran the taxi business for the most part, while Ernie was the store supervisor at the old Ontario Hospital / Victoria College at the top of College Street. Just behind the cars where George Brockenier ran his barber shop for many years, and George was current Mayor Gil Brockenier's father. A little further along, the liquor store resided for a period of time. The house on the extreme right side of the picture was owned by the Douglas family and was torn down in the early 50s to build the Park Theatre. Again, a little side note from my buddy P.L. In between Ernie's building and what became the Park Theatre was the site of several garage stations over the years. The picture shown here was of Bob Payne's service station. Mickey Campbell was another name that operated out of that site over the years. Next is the Park Theatre that opened up in the early 1950s. This next photo is of Jeff Rolfe's Esso station, which was at the corner of College and King Streets. In later years, it was owned by Bob Scanlon, and today it is Friendly Fires, barbecues, fireplaces, etc. The building to the left of the garage and part of the same property at that time was a doctor's office, with Doctors Scott, Wilson, Stobie, and Leeson, all plying their medical skills to many patients. This next picture is the Lakeview house on the southwest corner of King Street and Church Street. The property extended south to Queen Street and took in what is now the town's floral clock. Again, this is what we would classify as an inn, similar to the formerly talked about slumber inn. People would come and stay for a week or two, enjoy the parks and the Cobourg countryside with meals included. An interesting side note here is that when the Lakeview house went up for sale, a group of community-minded citizens started a fundraising campaign and with the help of town council purchased the property to help square off our crown jewel, Victoria Park. A friend of mine, former police chief Eugene Butler, was part of that campaign, and from his example and his love of the park, I later became part of the committee that many years later purchased the old Shadow Hotel property to truly square off the upper portion of the park. The next picture, of course, shows the War Memorial Gates to Victoria Park, with the Lakeview house in the background. The side note to this picture is that all across the top of the park in much earlier times was the Arlington Hotel. I, of course, don't remember it, but Keith Oliver told me that he was only 67 when it came down. The next photo is of the famous Shadow Hotel, formerly the Columbian, at the southeast corner of King and McGill Streets, and directly across the road from the Park Theatre. The house on the left was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, and I remember both of them very well. As previously mentioned, the Shadow was owned by Stan and Rosina Williams. The hotel was known for its fine dining and had a men's room at the front along with a liquor lounge. In later years, the Williams built a large addition at the back of the hotel along McGill Street, where they moved the men's room to and added a ladies' and escorts lounge, complete with a shuffleboard table. South of the Shadow, a wading pool was built in about 1956 to 58, and this picture shows it complete with a fencing around it. The pool was about 2 feet deep at the middle and was used regularly by mums with young toddlers that just found Lake Ontario too cold. This next picture is taken north and slightly west of today's present floral clock, and the hoodlums shown here from left to right are Brian Taylor, Roy Quigley, Ross Quigley, Murray Ewart, Wayne Jenkinson, and Pat Doherty, all good buddies and all very lucky to have grown up and around Victoria Park. This next picture is taken from Centennial Pool, looking north onto Queen Street. The building on the right is the back of the current post office. The white frame house in the middle of the picture was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Cuddy Woods. The corner of the building shown on the left is the Lakeshore Auto Building that is empty but still standing today. The Woods house and property was adjacent and to the west of where we lived, along with the Williams' 2 small cottages that we talked about earlier. I believe Mr. and Mrs. Woods both worked for the Dumble estate. They had 3 girls and 1 boy, Reg, whom spent his nearly whole working career at the post office, right across the street. Eventually, the Woods family sold the house to Lakeshore Auto. It was torn down, and their east side parking lot became considerably larger. This photo shows the Lakeshore building in more detail. I failed to mention earlier that the Lakeshore Auto building was the former Cobourg curling rink. Again, I don't remember it as such, but Keith Oliver remembers it vividly. The lane shown on the left took and still does take you up to the back entrances of the stores on King Street east of Division. Some of the businesses of that day that I can recall were Fisher's Dairy, Mitchell's Electric, Harvey Brent's Law Office, Hugh Calverley's Optometrist, and, of course, Mrs. Murney's Villa Marie boarding house. On the immediate left of the lane was Dunn Cleaners. 2 brothers by the names Bert and Joe ran it for many years. Bert was the quiet one, and Joe was the loud and talkative one. He was from Parry Sound and was a huge Bobby Orr and Boston Bruin fan. George Curtesis of pool room fame had a nickname for Joe. He always called him 6 foot. Joe might have been 5'5" with his high heels on. Next to Dunn Cleaners, on the west in what is now a new and modern building called the Taunton Block, was a long, low-slung insul brick building with small shops in it. One shop that I remember was Oscar Greer's small appliance repairs, and another was Bob McLaren's TV repair and TV aerial installation business. In those days, if you had TV, you had an aerial, and he was a very busy man. In those days, we knew the Taunton Block as the apartment building around the corner, facing onto Division Street. It was an old building, and a good friend of mine, Bruce Harp, lived there with his mom and dad and brother Dave. Just to the north of that apartment site, and directly across from Lakefront Utilities, was the Cobourg Credit Union, and was managed by Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor was a war veteran and also looked after the accounting for Cobourg Branch 133 Royal Canadian Legion for many years. After the new Taunton Block was constructed, Mr. Taylor's son Bob was the manager of Avco Finance right on the ground floor at the corner of Division and Queen Streets. From here we crossed the street to the southeast side of Queen and Division Streets, and where one Queen Street apartment building is now located. The next two photos are of the old Baltimore Hotel, which was located there when I grew up. The first is a frontal shot, and the second is looking northeast from the harbor. The Baltimore was owned by my good friend Freddie Barber's parents, and I spent many hours with Freddie and some of our other buddies in his living room in the upstairs of the hotel, listening to his huge collection of rock and roll hits from the 50s and 60s. Freddie's sister Patty would later marry Bill Ito. Bill and his family owned Spool-On Manufacturing on Division Street at Ewer Street here in Cobourg. Freddie and Patty's grandparents, the Lloyds, owned the Breakers Motel at the same time, and we spent a lot of time hanging around the beach at the Breakers, getting lots of snacks and drinks from Granny Lloyd. The Lloyd family descendants still own the Breakers today. Moving east on Queen Street from the Baltimore was all open field, where the existing professional building now stands. Directly behind the professional building, in those days, and facing onto Charles Street, was a red brick two-story home owned by Mert Giraldi and his wife. Mert worked at the PUC and at one time and later worked in the plumbing department at the Ontario Hospital. He was also a volunteer firefighter in Cobourg for many years. Moving further east on Queen Street, we arrive at the site of the present-day post office. In my days on McGill Street, there was a building on the right-hand portion of the existing building, and it was a business owned by Otto Curtis. It was called Curtis Products, and beauty aids such as hair dryers, etc., were dispersed from there. He later bought a building at the north end of Ball Street, also called Curtis Products, and where they manufactured office furniture. Otto Curtis was a Rotary president in 1968-69. The balance of the property in those days was basically vacant, and a place where TPT Transport would store their trailers. Another side note here, the area where the tractor trailer sat was covered in cinders, a result of the Cobourg Gas Works, which operated out of that site for many, many years in the very early days. Crossing McGill Street and moving further east on Queen, we come to the Cenotaph. When I grew up in this area, there were wonderful clay tennis courts between the Cenotaph and Queen Street. The courts were surrounded by a type of wire mesh, and the support poles were quite tall. Peter Delandy won the Junior Boys Championship there in 1902. Unfortunately, the courts were lost in October 1954 when Hurricane Hazel deposited two huge cottonwood trees into the middle of them, creating mass destruction. The remnants of the courts were removed and replaced with grass and trees. The next photos are of the wonderful lawn bowling greens and clubhouse. The club started in 1907 and celebrated 80 years in 1987, Cobourg's sesquicentennial year, with a tournament to honor the milestone. Next year, Canada's 150th celebration will be the club's 110th year in existence. I can remember as a kid going over and watching in the evenings this strange game that seemed so sedate and proper, with men and women wearing white clothing. The next picture in this series is an aerial view of Victoria Park, showing the wonderful ball diamond on the top right. I have played a lot of fastball games in a lot of cities, towns, and villages over the year, but there was never a better place to play or watch a ball game than Victoria Park on a hot summer's evening. Gentle lake breezes and a setting sun made for just a great atmosphere. In the 50s and 60s, it was not unusual to see 800 to 1,000 people at the ballpark watching the hometown Home-like Indians on Saturday nights. Bobby Hull played against Cobourg many times over the years for his hometown Point Anne Belleville team. The second aerial view shows the ball diamond, but also the legendary Cobourg Pavilion. This next photograph is of our lovely old band shell, complete with a picture of its band leader, J.H. Goldring, a well-known and respected gentleman. The next one is also of the band shell, but notice the permanent seating in the foreground. I remember it well, but could not put a year on its removal. This next picture of the band shell shows clearly the service road, complete with posts that ran from the bottom of Church Street to the bottom of McGill Street on the west, and was used by parked vehicles and other assorted vehicles for different events held in the park. You can still see remnants of the road today. Just to the bottom left of the bandshell was a small ball diamond facing southeast. This diamond was used a lot on weekends by people having family reunions. That happened a lot in those days. A little further to the east was this wonderful small brick building that was the park's yard or building for keeping rakes, shovels, wheelbarrows, and so on. The next photo shows the bandshell and the illustrious Cobourg Pavilion, a Saturday night dance hall in the summer, and a banquet hall, and a hall for hockey and football celebrations, as well as a place for men's stags put on by a local service club for a few years, until a local minister raised enough of a fuss to end it all. The next couple of pictures are great photos of the Pav, and the way most people my age and older remember it. The next picture shows Lawrence Brooks, or Brooksy, the swamper gopher at the chateau and the pavilion. Seated beside him is an old Legion softball buddy of mine, Tom Savage. The group of three people from left to right, I do not know who the first gentleman is, but the second is Shammy Shaw, later a bartender at the Rough Tough Plaza Hotel. Shammy apparently had been a very good boxer in his day. Just look at the forearms on him. And of course the man on the right is Brooksy again. Another side note, Brooksy was a huge New York Yankees fan, and every October he would go to New York City to watch his beloved Yankees in the World Series. In those days, the Yanks rarely missed going to the World Series. Another little side note about the Pav. For several years, there were 3 or 4 trampolines behind the Pav, which I believe were installed by Bob Purnell when he ran the Pav in the 1960s. You paid a fee for time used, and was very popular in his day. Don King, a teenage buddy of mine and later a Cobourg fire captain, was the best that I can remember on it. From here we moved to the southeast corner of Charles Street and Division Street, where today's ice cream parlor and Dr. Irwin's dentist office are located. In my days of living in the area, the house was owned by Ray Waite and his wife. 2 of their children were Don and Betty. Don later worked for Bird Archer for many years. He was also a fine ball player. Betty later married Bob Thompson and spent much of her working career as a nurse's aide at the Ontario Hospital. Just east of the Waite property, and where the municipal parking lot is now located, was a good-sized stucco duplex. It was later purchased and torn down by the town, and it became the site of the town's greenhouses, and then finally what it is today. The house shown in this next photo still exists today. It was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Ed Harp. Their son Roger, later a guidance counselor at CDCI East, was my best buddy in those days, and when we occasionally meet today, we will share a memory or two about the time we spent playing ball or hockey in Victoria Park. Roger's mom and dad ran the car license bureau out of the basement of their house for many years. Mrs. Harp is still alive today. I believe she is about 102 years old, and apparently she is still very much with it. This next picture is, of course, Centennial Pool, taken from the corner of McGill and Charles Street, with the Harp House in the background. In my growing up years, this was a ball diamond facing southwest, and where Roger Harp and myself and all our buddies would play ball almost every day in the warm weather. In the back corner of the pool area was a large 10-foot by 10-foot wooden shed, owned by the town's recreation department in those days. They ran a summer day camp there for many years, with badminton, volleyball, tetherball, etc. for kids in that area of town. I believe that the ball diamond and so on was removed to build Centennial Pool in and around 1967. This next photograph is of the town's sewage pumping station at the bottom of McGill Street. In our growing up years, this was a house that was lived in by the town of Cobourg's parks manager. And for us, it was quite a feat to hit a ball from the ball diamond off the north wall of the house. And no, I don't ever remember anyone breaking a window. 2 park superintendents that I remember well from those days were Ernie Robinson, who later became the caretaker at Victoria Hall. The other man was Pat Breon, who also looked after the arena in the winter months. The house was constructed of brick and painted white for all the time that I can remember it. In those days, the only entrance to the trailer park was from McGill Street. There was no entry from Division Street. In those years, there were 3 or 4 cabins in the trailer park that people could rent for vacation time. Most of them were on the north side of the grounds behind Centennial Pool and the Harp House, with the other being at the west end across from the harbor. In those days, there were very few trailers there, and most people tented it. There were no electrical sites in those days, and people used ice boxes to keep their foods and drinks cool. A side note again here, in those days, the McIver family from Buchanan Street would bring ice from their ice house to Victoria Park campgrounds and sell blocks to the campers. On hot summer days, the ice truck driver would slow down in front of our house on McGill Street and let us grab ice chips from the back of his half-ton. We would then sit on the curb and enjoy the treat. Simpler times, but oh so good. Many families would come and spend 2 weeks to a month camping in Victoria Park. 2 families that I recall growing up coming year after year, were the Simpson family from Oshawa and the Paget family from Peterborough. Mr. Paget worked at GE in Peterborough and would come down on weekends. His son Glenn and I later played fastball in the Peterborough City League. He went on to become a Peterborough alderman for a period of time. Here's a later picture of the trailer park, complete with trailers, with the west end of the path as backdrop. That is basically the end of my story about Victoria Park and my formative years, but I have found some old pictures of Cobourg that some of you may find interesting. The first is the H.W. Cooey Machine and Arms Factory that was located at the corner of King and Tremaine Streets for many years. They made shotguns and .22 caliber rifles. They probably employed 200 plus people in those days, and they were later bought by Winchester Western, and the plant was moved to Brook Road North. It is my understanding that a new park will be developed on that site in the near future, possibly called Cooey Park. This next picture is one of the true tragedies of my years living here in Cobourg, the tearing down of the old post office at the southeast corner of King and Division Street. It certainly would not be allowed to happen today. When I was growing up, it housed the post office, the customs office, RCMP offices, and possibly the Y. I remember being in that building with my mother and being fascinated with the Mounties in their high boots and funny hats. Not the red tunics, but a brown uniform with yellow piping. The outside walls were sandstone, similar to Victoria Hall. The next building was located at the Five Corners, kitty corner to the library. It was called Barney Lily's Corner, and I remember it as having a convenience store on the bottom floor at some point in time. This photo of Ralph Rennie Motors was located right across from the Market Square on 2nd Street. It later became McGill Motors, then Curry Tire, and was then eventually torn down. Where our hardware store was located on 2nd Street, just above this photo, was once a town-owned duplex that housed the fire chief of the day, and Mr. Campbell, and the town public works foreman, Ed Jenkins. Behind the house, and including our former store, was where the town yards were located in those days. This next photo of Wilson Motors is right at the corner of Division and Covered Streets, directly south of Quinn Flores. Cease Wilson was the proprietor of the day. The Cobourg Cafe, located on the north side of King Street, directly opposite 1st Street, or the alleyway running along beside the Dutch oven. The gentleman shown in this picture is Joe Ing. He later moved his business to the corner of King and McGill Streets and changed the name to Hooley Gardens. His son Gam took over the business and ran it for many years. The lady shown in the picture is Ruth Brock. She worked at the Cobourg Cafe and Hooley Gardens for over 50 years. This next photo may be a surprise to many of you. This slide, owned by the Davis family, was located on the Cobourg Beach. This photo is circa 1940. This picture is of the old Dunn Hotel that was located at the northeast corner of Division and Swain Streets, and was known to be a rough place to have a drink. Owners that I can recall over the years were Mr. Taylor and later Joe Spring. The next photo is of the Homelike Inn, or as most of it know it as simply Kelly's, owned by the Kelly family since about 1930, I believe, to present day. Always the working man's hotel, it had rooms to rent upstairs for many years and still serves a great breakfast and lunch 6 days a week. The next few pictures are of the former Cobourg Golf Course. The clubhouse was located at the corner of Division and Elgin Streets, the home of McKean Motors, for many years, and just recently, Boyer Dodge Chrysler. The course ran east and then south, and now is that large subdivision directly across from Union Cemetery. These next two photos were taken at the Cobourg Harbor. The people in bathing suits were participants in the swimming portion of the Labor Day Games that were held each Labor Day in Victoria Park and the Cobourg Harbor. Track and field and swimming was the focus of the day. The games were held in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The next photograph is of the harbor in the 1970s. Note the terrible condition of the old wooden piers. Be ever so thankful that we have what we have at the harbor today. Anyone that I grew up with here about the same time will tell you what we had there in those days were oil tanks, coal piles, an old factory, the old CN freight shed. Not a pretty place. This next photo from the beach shows part of a large coal pile in the background. And this aerial shot shows the old oil tank farm, which now houses Legion Village and the condominium complex to the east. I would be very remiss at this point if I did not mention James Hoffman, a developer who had many arguments with town officials over the years, but had the vision and perseverance over the years to tear down, clean up, and then rehabilitate those lands to allow the buildings of today. The last picture that I will show you of is of the Ideal Fish and Chip Shop, right about where Corfu's restaurant is on King Street, just east of Division. It was later owned by Ernie McCrum and then by the Gagne family. Absolutely the best fish and chips anywhere. And next to their business was Andrew's Bakery for many years, and they had the biggest and best honey dip donuts ever made, and only 5 cents. As we say in our family, these things always end up talking about the food. This ends my presentation about the area where I grew up in wonderful Cobourg. I hope you have enjoyed it half as much as I have enjoyed reminiscing about it. Thank you.